Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. This year marks the 70th year since the Korean War started, but tensions still remain on the Korean peninsula. It marks a stark contrast from 2 years ago when a dialogue with North Korea was underway. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton's memoir has stirred up controversy in Washington and Seoul over issues on Pyongyang. Today we discuss these and more. Joining us today is Bruce Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He's an expert in Northeast Asian military issues and has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Pacific Command and Central Command, as well as the ROK and Japanese militaries. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S. Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy and offers predictions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Connie.
I want to start with North Korea's latest behavior. North Korea's chairman, Kim Jong-un, had suspended all military action plans against South Korea, and this is a dramatic U-turn from its previous stance. So why did this drastic change come about? Let's start with you, Dr. Bennett.
Well, I think we have to recognize that the underlying crisis right now, as Scott talked about last week, is with the North Korean economy. On June 7th, Kim Jong-un had a Politburo meeting in which one of the issues discussed was the fact that he's not able to feed all of the people in Pyongyang, that they're having trouble with food and other things there. The sanctions are finally hitting. That's in conjunction with the COVID closing of the borders and making things difficult internally for Kim Jong-un. So I think he had listened to the statements of some of President Moon's advisors, that President Moon was close to deciding to set up inter-Korean projects that would probably have been in violation of the sanctions, and thought that if he just pushed a little harder that he could get that to happen. Instead, he pushed too hard, and President Moon has now pushed back. The Blue House has indicated a great degree of distress over Kim Jong-un's violations of peaceful coexistence, and now I think Kim Jong-un is thinking, I'm desperate. I've got to break the sanctions problem, and so he's going to try another tack, I think.
So Dr. Bennett pointed out how North Korea may be stepping one step back in order to get what they want. Mr. Snyder, did you see any other intentions behind this?
Well, what I think has come into focus over the course of the past few weeks has been the consistent targeting by North Korea in their external rhetoric of the U.S. ROK alliance, and particularly the coordination group. And so, this really brings to mind North Korea's default Uri Minjok-Kiri strategy. And it looks like North Korea really wants to peel off the Moon administration from the United States, which is exactly what would happen if South Korea were to begin to provide assistance to North Korea by circumventing the intent of sanctions. And so what I think is really most interesting this week is Kim Young-chol's statement in response to the South Korean defense minister's noting that North Korea had suspended but not dropped its plans. And really the tone of that statement was such that it sounded like a protection racket threat, where Kim Young-chol was essentially warning that reinitiation would be a possible step rather than suspension.
Mm-hmm. So North Korea does have track history of escalating tensions to the max and de-escalating them. So according to this past history, at what point do you think North Korea may be pushing to ratchet up tensions again with South Korea?
One thing that the North Koreans have traditionally relied on has been the element of surprise. And so it does, what I think was a little bit odd in the recent provocations is that they were telegraphed. And so in some sense, pulling back allows the North Koreans to recover an element of surprise, but I think that they'll probably wait and see whether the actions that have been taken thus far actually loosen things up in a way that might motivate the South Korean government to respond.
So, Dr. Bennett, Mr. Snyder mentioned how North Korea launches surprise provocations. How should the U.S. and South Korea be prepared militarily? A senior defense official did point out that it's hard to determine tactically what North Korea is going to do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. The U.S. and South Korea have got to be very concerned right now about any kind of possibility from North Korea. Traditionally, we focused on was North Korea mobilizing its forces to invade the South. But in a nuclear weapon environment, North Korea could fire 20 nuclear weapons at South Korea and neutralize major parts of especially the South Korean Air Force and command control system in South Korea, and then mobilize and move. The US and South Korea have got to be very, very ready to deal with that kind of surprise action because, as Scott said, North Korea really focuses on taking action with surprise. And so this is therefore a much more difficult situation. We have to have our missile defenses ready. We have to be prepared to the extent necessary to preempt North Korea with strategic attack. And North Korea really is giving us no choice. They've destabilized the environment by building so many weapons.
So there was some analysis that Kim Yo-jong was playing the bad cop here and Kim Jong-un was playing the good cop. So how do you forecast inter-Korean relations going forward? Because we did hear North Korea say that they didn't withdraw from its military action plans.
I mean, the key here really is that North Korea may have different voices, but we haven't seen evidence that they don't have a unified strategy. And so I think that we have to interpret what we hear from North Korea a little bit different, for instance, from the differing voices that we hear, for instance, from Washington or from democracies rather than authoritarian dictatorships.
I want to shift our focus a little bit to the memoir that was published by Ambassador Bolton, The Room Where It Happened. According to Bolton, he claims that President Moon had called President Trump, telling him that Kim Jong-un had agreed to a one-year denuclearization, a promise. So this is Bolton's claim, but there has been some criticism that South Korea may have exaggerated North Korea's denuclearization position. How did you see Bolton's claim, and how did you see South Korea's role as a mediator?
My reaction to that was that I think it's much more likely that Kim Jong-un lied, that he agreed to do some things with President Moon, but didn't intend to do them. We can see that from other behaviors, including his violations of the Panmunjom Agreement. So I think President Moon was hopeful, as is President Trump. So they were very prone to believe him and hope that things would work out. But I don't think we should assume that Kim Jong-un is going to be willing to do everything he says. So I think the burden of problems here is on the Korean side.
The really important thing here is that once South Korea had played an intermediary role, the job of Bolton and Pompeo was simply to go back and confirm whatever message Chung Woo-young passed along. And so I think that it's a little bit of a low blow for Bolton to suggest that the blame lies with Moon and Chung when it's actually the responsibility of Bolton and Pompeo to confirm what was said. And then, of course, the other aspect is whether or not Trump can take that counsel. And that came through very strongly, Trump's eagerness to meet with Kim Jong-un, regardless of substance, for the sake of a photo op.
Mm-hmm. So you did say that it may have been Bolton's narrative in describing South Korea's role as a mediator. So presidential office of Cheongwade did say that Bolton was not reflecting accurate facts and was distorting them. And Bolton responded by saying that he would be doing disservice if he wasn't telling the truth. So how did you see this back and forth?
Well, I think it's the truth as Bolton saw it, and we'll have to wait for the Moon and Chung memoirs and a more specific level of detail to be released on the South Korean side. The other aspect here is the South Korean allegation that Bolton is breaching intelligence protocols by being so explicit about the content of the conversations.
Bolton also claims that the US and South Korea had different priorities when it came to North Korea's denuclearization. A senior State Department official said that there had been intense dialogue with its South Korean ally when talks were underway with North Korea. So help us understand where this gap comes from.
Not at all surprising that there should be differences in interest between the two sides. The key is, to what degree have we been able to synchronize those interests in terms of dealing with North Korea? Obviously, on the missiles, we have done a very good job. We're looking at two different perspectives. On the nuclear weapons, I think we were likely closer.
Mr. Snyder, do you think that there was no synchronization between the two administrations?
I think there was a constant effort at coordination, but I do believe that some of the senior level comments in the Moon administration at that time did represent a possible attempt by the Moon administration to define the scope of denuclearization necessary to move forward at a lower level than the Trump administration was determined to achieve. And so that's where we had public statements, even at the time, from President Moon following the Pyongyang summit, as suggesting that, well, if we just deal with, if we get into Yongbyon, then we can say that denuclearization is irreversible. And those sorts of statements, I think, were representative publicly of a gap in the scope of denuclearization that President Moon was looking for, compared to what the U.S. government was likely to require. Maybe not Trump, but the U.S. government was likely to try to insist on as part of a denuclearization deal with North Korea.
Mm-hmm. If we look at the U.S.-North Korea talks, how do you think Bolton's claim is going to affect the diplomacy going forward? Because we hear President Trump saying that Bolton was lying in this book, and we hear administration officials say disclosing unauthorized classified information threatens national security.
The president himself has been on the edge with information. For example, after the Hanoi summit, he talks about Kim Jong-un and not necessarily being willing to close all of the uranium enrichment facilities, but not getting into much more detail than that. A lot of helping the public understand what is going on in these negotiations is tied to the details of what they're really talking about. Is there only one uranium enrichment facility in North Korea? No, I think it's pretty clear that there are probably at least 3 or 4, maybe more. And so that sets the nature of expectations. But if we're interested in making it look like we're making progress, we're not necessarily going to talk a lot about the other facilities if we can get something accomplished. It all depends on the perspective.
So Bolton claims that North Korea believes that they can get an agreement with the president if he separates him from his aides. So do you think that North Korea may be eyeing to have a deal with the president?
I think the really interesting question is whether the publication of the Bolton memoir provides a pretext for North Korea to make another run at diplomacy with the United States. In some ways, all of the burdens that Kim Jong-un had faced post-Hanoi, can be shifted and blamed on Bolton if the North Koreans decided that they wanted to come back to talks. And I think that Bolton provided a very clear and crisp view of some of the differences within the Trump administration on how to approach North Korea. But it's hard to say whether North Korea would be able to take advantage of that.
Well, North Korea did claim that Bolton and Secretary Pompeo were hindering negotiations from moving forward. So we'll have to see how North Korea takes into consideration Bolton's claim in his book. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Bennett and Mr. Snyder.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. That does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis. Goodbye.